Before I begin, I would like to thank Sarah Dickinson for the invitation and for chairing this workshop. I am also very grateful to Anastasia Andrianova for kindly agreeing to serve as my discussant, to read my draft, and to offer feedback at this early stage of the paper. I would like to begin by thanking Sarah Dickinson for inviting me to take part in this workshop and for organizing our discussion. I am also very grateful to Anastasia Andrianova for agreeing to be my discussant. I very much appreciate her time, her careful reading of the paper, and the feedback she will offer on a draft that is still very much in progress. Thank you very much, Anastasia, for this careful and generous reading of my paper. Your comments are extremely helpful, especially because this is still an exploratory draft and I am now trying to rethink its central argument and structure. My name is Lyudmila Harmash. I work on contemporary Ukrainian wartime literature with a broader interest in trauma, memory, testimony, and the forms of writing that emerge while the war is still ongoing. This paper is part of that larger project, but it is also somewhat experimental for me because it tries to bring together trauma studies, gender, and the analysis of poetic voice. The current version of the paper is titled Creating Under Constraint: Gender, Trauma, and Voice in Contemporary Ukrainian Wartime Literature. It focuses on two poets, Oksana Maximchuk, especially her collection Still City, and Serhiy Zhaydin, especially the cycle New Poems 20,000,000 to 112,020 to From Hellfire Descends. My initial idea was to compare two different forms of wartime testimony. In Maximchuk, trauma is articulated through the body, maternal anxiety, intimacy, care, domestic space, and the fragility of speech. In Zhaydin, trauma is articulated through the city, the dead, collective memory, public address, and the imperative to speak. However, after rereading the draft, I see that the argument is still too schematic. The paper says that it wants to avoid a simple binary opposition between female and male wartime writing, but in fact this binary is central to the material itself. I now think that I should not try to move beyond this binary too quickly. Instead, I want to make it the real objective analysis. The revised paper will therefore ask how female and male wartime poetics are produced in the texts themselves. I do not want to treat one mode as stronger or more important than the other. On the contrary, the force of both poets lies in the clarity with which each develops a distinct regime of wartime testimony. Maximchuk shows how the body, the child, the home, fear, care, and intimate address become sites where the war becomes historically and ethically knowable. Zhaydin shows how the city, the dead, collective memory, and the public imperative to speak become forms through which a damaged community tries to preserve its world in language. The main change I want to make is to introduce a more dynamic structure. Maximchuk seems to move from the intimate to the collective. The body, the domestic object, and the private relation gradually become forms of collective memory. Zhaydin seems to move in the opposite direction. He begins from the public, the urban, and the collective, but this public voice gradually becomes intimate, vulnerable, and dependent on the dead, the absent, and those who cannot answer. So I would like to revise the paper around this double movement, from the private to the collective in Maximchuk, and from the collective to the intimate in Zhaydin. At this stage, I am less interested in defending the current draft than in using it as a first map for a stronger article. Ideally, I would like the final version to become a publishable article on gendered forms of wartime testimony in contemporary Ukrainian poetry, probably for a journal in Ukrainian studies, Slavic studies, or literary trauma studies. The draft helped me identify the real problem. I now see that the binary between female and male wartime writing should not be denied. It should be analyzed as the central structure of the paper. Maximchuk moves from the intimate to the collective. Zhaydin moves from the collective to the intimate. Maximchuk writes the collective through the intimate. Zhaydin writes the intimate through the public. The contrast is not simply between private and public wartime writing. Maximchuk makes the intimate a form of historical and collective testimony, while Zhaydin reveals the intimate vulnerability inside public and mnemonic speech. At this stage, I am considering whether the revised paper could be organized around a double movement, or, more precisely, around two different crossings of the intimate and the collective. Maximchuk writes the collective through the intimate, while Zhaydin reveals the intimate vulnerability inside public memory and collective address. Movement names the broader poetic tendency. Intersection describes the actual textual mechanism. I first thought of the contrasts as a double movement. Maximchuk moves from the intimate to the collective, while Zhaydin moves from the collective to the intimate, but I now think this may be too schematic. More precisely, the revised paper should examine how the intimate and the collective intersect differently in each poet. In Maximchuk, collective historical trauma is written through the body, the home, care, and intimate objects. In Zodin, intimate vulnerability emerges inside public memory, urban space, and collective address. Thank you very much for this fascinating paper. I found the material itself extremely rich. The prayer books, the inserted prayer cards, handwritten notes, marginalia, photographs, and other devotional objects create a very compelling archive of lived Catholic practice. I especially like the way the paper treats the prayer book not simply as a printed religious text, but as an object that accumulates voices, presences, gestures, and traces of use over time. For me, one of the strongest parts of the paper is the argument about authority. I found it very persuasive that these books are not authorized only by a named author, editor, priest, or ecclesiastical institution, but also through the act of compilation itself. The idea that authority emerges through gathering, arranging, transmitting, and redeploying the words of others seems very productive. It also gives a strong way to think about prayer as a collective form, even when it is practiced individually. The part I found harder to follow was the transition from the discussion of compilation and accumulated voices to the later discussion of the Virgin Mary as the patron and protector of Hungary. Both parts are very interesting, but I was not always sure how they are connected in the structure of the argument. Is Mary another example of composite authority, similar to the prayer book itself? Or is she the central figure who gives this accumulated devotional world its national and territorial meaning? I think making this transition more explicit would strengthen the chapter considerably. I also wondered whether the paper might benefit from clarifying the hierarchy of its central claims. At some moments, the main argument seems to be about the authority of prayer books as compiled texts. At other moments, it seems to be about Marian devotion and Hungarian Catholic community formation. At still other moments, the larger frame of communist Hungary appears, but it is not yet fully integrated into the analysis. I think all three dimensions are potentially important, but the reader may need a clearer statement of which one is primary in this chapter.
One possible way to sharpen the argument would be to say more directly that the prayer book works as a devotional technology of community formation. It gathers voices from different times, places, institutions, and devotional traditions, and through this gathering it makes Catholic community imaginable and repeatable. Then the figure of Mary could be introduced as the central devotional presence, who gives this gathered community a territorial and national form. Hungary is Mary's country, or Regnum Marianum. In terms of additional sources, I wondered whether work on material religion, lived religion, and book history might be useful here. For example, scholarship on devotional objects, marginalia, religious reading practices, or compilation as a form of authority. I also think the paper might benefit from more explicit engagement with scholarship on Marian devotion, national Catholicism, and Hungarian religious life under communism. Overall, I found the paper very promising. Its strongest contribution, in my view, is the way it moves beyond institutional history and shows how ordinary devotional books can preserve, organize, and transmit collective religious life. My main suggestion would be to make the argumentative bridge clearer, from prayer books as accumulations of voices, to Mary as a composite figure of authority, to Hungarian Catholic community across territory and time. Thank you very much for this fascinating paper. I found the material extremely rich. The prayer books, inserted cards, handwritten notes, marginalia, photographs, and other devotional objects create a compelling archive of lived Catholic practice. I especially liked the argument that the authority of these books does not come only from a named author, editor, priest, or institution, but from the act of compilation itself, from gathering and transmitting the words of others. The main point I found harder to follow was the transition from compiled voices and the authority of prayer books to the figure of the Virgin Mary as patron and protector of Hungary. Both parts are very interesting, but I think the connection between them could be made more explicit. Is Mary another form of composite authority, parallel to the prayer book, or is she the figure who gives this accumulated devotional world its national and territorial meaning? My main suggestion would be to clarify the hierarchy of the argument. Is the chapter primarily about prayer books as compiled devotional objects, about Marian devotion and Hungarian Catholic community formation, or about religious life under communism? These dimensions can work together, but the reader needs a clearer bridge between them. Overall, I found the paper very promising, especially in the way it shows how ordinary devotional books preserve and organize collective religious life across time, territory, and community. I think the strongest contribution of the paper is the idea that compilation itself becomes a form of religious authority. The transition to Mary as patron and protector of Hungary is very interesting, but I think it needs a clearer argumentative bridge. Sarah, I saw that there is another workshop on June 10. Would it be possible for me to attend it as well? I would be very interested in listening to the discussion, if that's possible. Sarah, may I ask whether it would be possible for me to attend the workshop on June 10 as well? I'd be very interested in listening to the discussion. By the way, Sarah, I saw that there is another workshop on June 10. Would it be all right if I attended that one too, just to listen to the discussion?